Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our webinar this week, The Role of Public Housing in a New Social Housing System. I'll have more to say in a minute about today's webinar, but I always want to give a shout out for upcoming events. So next Friday, the Joint Center will be hosting live at the Graduate School of Design, the 2024 Ivory Prize Housing Innovation Summit. This will be an event that will last all afternoon and will feature winners of the Ivy Prize in Housing Innovation from last year's contest across 3 domains. 10 companies who were the finalists and the 3 winners, plus a Hack a House contest that students participated in last month. We will have a runoff between the 3 finalists in the different categories for people to pick among those for the grand prize winners. So that'll be a fun event. As I said, it's live at the Graduate School of Design, but also available over online via webcast. The following week, on Friday the 1st, we will have another research seminar, The Decades Ahead, Projecting Household Growth and New Housing Demand Over the Next 20 Years by my colleague, Dan McHugh. This is work the Joint Center has done for a number of years now, and has been we've been waiting for census population projections to be able to enable the next set. And so I think it'll be really interesting and important work as we look at what the likely demand for housing will be over the next 20 years. But for today, I'm really pleased to have Alex von Hoffman, who is a senior fellow at the Joint Center. He's been at the Joint Center for several decades, longer than he probably cares to be reminded of. He is one of the preeminent urban historians in the U.S., particularly on the housing domain. And the genesis of today's paper, I and others here have become increasingly interested in the conversation that's bubbling up at many state and local levels, as well as now the federal level, about thinking about new forms of affordable housing, small a or capital A, which is falling under the rubric of social housing. Now, we can have a whole seminar on what defines social housing and what are its key attributes. But there are a lot of options, and many of them focus on the role of the public sector as developer. And so in that context, I was having a conversation with Alex von Hoffman, who is a historian of U.S. housing policy, and talking to him about this latest evolution in our housing policy. And Alex was quick to point out that it's really important for anyone trying to craft a new approach to policy to understand the history. And you need to understand the history for 2 reasons. One is that the lessons of what the intentions were for people pushing through policy innovation over time, what their intentions were versus what happened in practice. And what happens in practice happens both because of politics and different stakeholders and how they get to influence the choices, as well as market and institutional landscape. And so as we think about a potential new form of social housing in the U.S., with the public sector taking a role, it's really important to take stock of public housing as what has been the main form of social housing in the U.S., to understand its history. How did it come to be shaped as it is today? And what's the capacity of that system? And so Alex undertook to write this paper to delineate that history and the current state with an eye towards informing social housing discussions today. I'm really pleased with how the paper came out. I think this is must reading for anyone who's thinking about designing a new system. So with that, let me turn it over to Alex to present this paper. By the way, I should say the paper is forthcoming. It's in its last stages. It should be posted next week. So stay tuned for the actual paper itself. But Alex, welcome. Thanks for taking doing this paper and being with us today. So the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm now going to hire you as my agent because of your kind words. You've said such wonderful things. I really want to get you in full time on that. On that. Now, let's see if I can. Oh, here we go. Share. All right. There. Good. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. As Chris well knows, the housing is a wonderful and complex subject that you can spend a lifetime trying to master, and I think I have. Feels like it. But I really appreciate this opportunity to be here and talk on this subject of the role of public housing in a new social housing system. So let's see if this works. Well, There we go. All right. So social housing. So lately in housing policy circles, as Chris kind of alluded to, there's been a lot of excitement about creating a social housing system, maybe similar to those that have been found in Europe. The people are talking about it and they've been writing about it. And the definition that I've been could glean from it, the basic fundamental common denominator is that it would be a system of government or government-funded agencies that develop, own, and manage housing for low-income Americans outside the private for-profit market. All right, so that seems clear enough, but I think there's also something else, because I think the people who are excited about social housing envision agencies, possibly government agencies. Montgomery County is an example that people are talking about that are active, that are innovative, entrepreneurial, looking for opportunities to develop housing, to try new approaches to developing it and running the program in different ways, mixed income, all sorts of ways to do it. So that's very exciting. So, but there is a funny thing, which is America already has a social housing program. In fact, it started one almost 100 years ago. In the movement started in the 1920s, and we get it in the 1930s, and that is public housing. It fits the definition of social housing. And recently it's begun, a number of reforms have begun to revitalize it. We'll talk about that later. At present, it houses more than 900,000 households, and at its peak, 1.4 million. So the question that this whole paper and is part of an investigation, might the public housing program be a key component of a new system of affordable housing program? So that's what we're talking about. So as I say, we are kind of repeating history here in that starting in the 1920s, a small band of progressive era reformers and socialists looked to Europe for models of affordable housing programs, which when they were talking about it, they referred to sometimes as municipal housing because they thought of municipalities running it, or public housing because it sounded good. It sounded like public schools, so that seemed palatable. Or sometimes actually called it social housing. And they had tours going to Europe to look at examples of housing. Red Vienna was one of the stops along the way. There are many different approaches that they looked at, and as they did, they came back with many ideas, and they fashioned a public housing movement, really, but it was not a grassroots movement. There was no, in the 1930s, great demand for public housing. In fact, very few people knew what it meant or what it was. It seemed like some strange idea at first. And so this party band of reformers called on liberal interest groups, and they were able to persuade organized labor and the big city mayors, social workers, different segments of the liberal alliance that voted Franklin Roosevelt into the presidency. And with their help, they persuaded Roosevelt and his administration and the Congress in 1933 to fund a trial program as part of a public works bill, and then in 1937 to pass this Housing Act, which established a permanent public housing program. So under this act, locally established states passed enabling legislation, municipalities established public housing authorities, or PHAs, as we call them, to build and manage residences that they rented. It's a rental program to low-income households. And the federal government subsidized the construction of those housing projects through what they called annual contribution contracts, which they paid to the PHAs. Now, of course, with that came guidelines, right? And so right at the beginning, you have a relationship between the federal government and the local agency or authority, and restrictions and possibilities because they get this money paid. Now, originally, the PHAs, these housing authorities, were to cover the costs of the operations and the maintenance of the building once it was built with federal subsidies to from the rents, from the project rents that they got. So they would get the revenue from the project rents. That was the original idea. And that idea was put into place and it worked. They were able to build lots of housing. Now, I will say, Chris alluded to, there were many ideas as to what the purpose of public housing would be, what would be the scope, who would live in it exactly, and so on. So some people, notably Catherine Bauer, who was one of the authors of the 1937 Act, envisioned a broad-based kind of working to lower middle class housing program. It would cover all of that, kind of oriented to labor, really. That was, she was represented, she got a job representing labor organizations, and that's how she envisioned it, because that's what she had gleaned from her European trip, that you could have this sort of working class movement, right? Like social democratic type of movement. But others were more interested in curing the problem of the slums, right? And they took more of either a social work point of view, that the slums were decrepit, horrible places, and it was affecting morals, behavior, health, and so on of the occupants, or sometimes pure real estate point of view, which is the slums were unsightly, and it would seem better if they could be redeveloped into something a little spiffier. So here we have this cartoon from the 30s, which reflects that, and you can see the carpenter, who looks suspiciously like Franklin Roosevelt, coming to operate slum clearance, you see. So housing, the housing project comes with slum clearance. And in fact, it was that argument that that won the day. And so you see here at the New York City Housing Authority, these wonderful 1930s posters, which express the whole idea that it's the slum that can be eradicated. So right away, and with that came the idea that, well, you really don't want the middle class in there. You want the poor slum dwellers, the people who are in there. And then so some of the people, social worker types, talked about rehousing. You tear down the slums, you rehouse the people who live in it into something better, and you make them into better people, was their assumption. So, and so they were able to do that. Spread the program across the country was essentially to dangle money to the municipalities that from the federal government in the Depression that looked pretty good. So here we have the America's first public housing project, Techwood in Atlanta, now no more, but you can see it had a communal quality, especially at the beginning, of a kind of really community-oriented apartment block dwelling, so and handsome, right? And so the movement spread, and it took hold, especially in places where there are liberal political cultures and history, or at least people, it was popular in the South too, where the governments were willing to take federal money and to engage in federal government programs. So interesting fact is that New York State, which is in New York City, is the place where the political campaign for public housing began, has 1/5 of all public housing residents in the United States. So because of that. And so of some 3,000 PHAs today, the largest own 1,000 or more public housing units, and this is an important fact that comes in later, they possess more than half of all the public housing stock. Uh, and generally, these large authorities operate out of our largest cities or metropolitan areas. But most of the public housing authorities operate outside the largest cities and have a relatively small number of dwellings. All right. So that's going to be important because, and I won't go into all the detail, but in order to spread the gospel of public housing, federal officials and the people who advocates for public housing spread out across the country and had to convince and persuade local officials to adopt the program. So it wasn't a groundswell. It came from a big organizing push, which was quite successful. There, as I say, about more than 3,000 PHAs today. Now, public housing has its flaws, all right, from the very beginning. It's been beset by challenges. The program has endured attacks from conservatives and private industry, especially in the 1940s and 50s. There was a lot of local opposition to projects. Middle-class people of whatever race really disliked the idea. And also a lot of people who were in areas that were being condemned as slums didn't feel they lived in slums, wanted to keep their homes. So there was pushback, as they say. And also the appropriations from the federal government have never matched what the advocates think it deserves to make it a good functioning program. On the other hand, some of the wounds are self-inflicted. For many years, the housing authorities took a paternalistic attitude towards their tenants. They would give them a lot of rules and regulations that they should obey by that you would never see in private rental residences and complexes. And perhaps worst of all, they segregated the public housing projects by race, almost by rule. There's very few exceptions, and those exceptions are fairly minimal even when that happens. So it's been, and many of you perhaps know, there's a long haul to get public housing. And so, let's see where we go. Right. And then setting the rents was a problem. In the 1930s, they wanted people, they wanted low-income people, but they didn't want indigent people. They didn't want people on what we would say on the dole or on welfare. They wanted people who were, in their words, respectable, that's in quotes, and that would be married couples with employed head of household, very much stable. Well, during the Depression, they could get those people because of the underemployment and underpay meant that there were a lot of people like that who could qualify, but there were also a lot of people who didn't qualify, and often they lived on the sites of the public housing project. So the rehousing aspect began to go by the boards, which doesn't mean that public housing didn't house people who were had the needs for it. It just means that there was a lot of political turmoil around that fact that the people there were displaced and not given new homes. And so public housing also signed up for large-scale urban renewal in the 30s, 40s, and 1950s, and part of great clearances of communities of color and working class communities generally. All right. And so that still, there were a lot of, I don't want to overstate that, there were a lot of all these small public housing authorities did a fairly good job of putting together housing projects. They might not have been large, they might not have been glamorous, but they did fulfill their mission to produce public housing, right? So it went pretty well in the Depression. There are many wrinkles to this story after the war. The government wanted to put the veterans into the public housing projects, which meant that they broke the requirements for income, and they were putting people who would be considered over income in there. But we'll glide over that because the really important problems come in the late 20th century when the demographics of central cities change, and particularly public housing, as although in the 1950s, the large-scale high-rise projects that you see in a lot of large cities were successful in the sense that the tenants were happy. As time went on, public housing authorities had trouble attracting the kinds of tenants that they had in the 1930s. And gradually, the tenantry becomes of a lower income, or they have vacancies because they can't find married head couples to take these units. And so there's a kind of ruined spiral that a lot of large city authorities go into, which starts with apartment vacancies, and then the revenues for the rent declines. That means they don't maintain it as well. So the morale of the authority and the property managers begins to drop. Or we can say they've lost their sense of mission. You can criticize them if you want, but anyway, the result is that the physical stock deteriorates, which means fewer people want to live in it, and then crime and disorder also become hallmarks of large-scale public housing projects. So the early example of this that precedes lots of that would come later is the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis, which despite millions of dollars put in to resuscitate it, was built in the mid-1950s. By 1965, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal government, is dumping lots of money to renovate and try to make it attractive. Doesn't work. It continues to decline. And at a certain point, for whatever reason, the St. Louis Housing Authority decides that the only thing they can do is to clear the projects, these mammoth housing projects, completely, and blow them up, which was certainly a pivotal moment in American public housing history, and foreshadowed what would come in the 1990s and 2000s of demolishing public housing. So let's see what I have next. Yes, okay, so that comes next. I'm afraid I'm going to just have to sit on this particular slide. So, despite the drama of this slide, my research shows that there is actually another fundamental and often overlooked problem with the public housing program, and that is its organizational culture. Because, and I think it comes to the fore here because when crisis came, the local public housing authorities were helpless to adapt to changing circumstances. And that comes from their fundamental dependence on the federal government. So you have the board members and directors of the housing authorities become bureaucratic. They're more focused on what Washington administrators want them to do than their own tenants. And so as early as the 1950s, Catherine Bauer, the author of the 1937 law, notes that the PHAs have lapsed into excessive caution, administrative rigidity, and lack of creative initiative. So what to do? Well, officials in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations then these are the liberal policymakers, to seek alternative ways to produce low-income housing. So that's when they turn to the private sector, the nonprofit private sector, and then ultimately both nonprofit and for-profit, to produce low-income housing. They don't abandon public housing, but they add these other programs. And out of them, you've probably heard of the Section 8 program, started in 1974, and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program started in 1986, which subsidize private, nonprofit, and for-profit enterprises rather than government agencies. And in addition, the government also begins this experiment that eventually becomes the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So, and so public housing at this point has become, or it's come to be seen as a social welfare program catering to very low income households, which is what it does today. And so Congress begins to provide additional appropriations, but it's a very difficult time. And at the same time, Congress burdens the housing authorities with new responsibilities. They have to administer the rental vouchers, provide social services to help make their clients financially self-sufficient. And so that's when you get to this point in the 1980s when the government, and you see this report, begin to see that they have to do something about this. And so with the big city projects, had a huge backlog of maintenance and improvement issues. They needed large expenditures. The public housing tenants who relied on public welfare assistance or were unemployed were not going to provide the rents to pay for all this. And when you get in the 80s and the 1990s, Congress resists new appropriations and imposes new conditions on construction. So they try to restrict new construction. There's something called the Faircloth Amendment that prohibits the housing authorities from increasing the number of their public housing dwellings from whatever they have at that moment in 1998. So that brings us to the new world, which is the government begins in the 1990s to enact a series of measures that invited, in a way, enabled and invited PHAs to break away from the traditional public housing program as far as its way of funding and operating public housing. So they are, I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. We can go if you want, but there are a number of them, all with names that don't tell you anything about what they actually do. One is Hope 6, which is the large redevelopment of public housing program that ran from 1993 to 2011. And it allowed the housing authorities to go into partnerships with private developers to mix public housing funding that they got from the federal government with other sources of funds, be they public or private, to rebuild this. And so PHAs could use rental vouchers while their private partners use low-income housing tax credit. I'd get mix of incomes and so on. So that kind of opens up the door and name up a number of other moving to work in 1996 allows exceptions to the public housing authorities, the ones that was a test program to begin with, to use their funds in different ways. They don't have to follow all the housing and voucher rules strictly, so that they can do alternative ways of figuring out what the rents should be, offering landlords incentives to take voucher holders, and also this asset building to help tenants manage their personal finances. So that's yet another program. This is kind of made permanent, or some of these innovations, especially from Hope 6, are made permanent in a law in 1998, which allows local agencies to use bonds, they issue bonds to renovate and develop new housing, although they get that Faircloth tax on, they can't go above that. Also, to more generally, not just the participants in Hope 6, allow them to participate in what this mixed finance projects, which uses capital funds for private investment in housing construction or rehab. And so let's go to Brad. There we go. And then finally, in 2012, Congress authorized the Rental Assistance Program, which is a new sweeping reform that authorized the housing authorities to convert their longstanding annual contribution contracts to long-term project-based Section 8 subsidies. So they switch it from one program to another. And this means that the housing authorities could finance their debt and obtain other kinds of funding, including grants and private sector equity investments, again, with a low-income housing tax credit, for example. So housing authorities under RAD could actually own or control projects by forming limited liability corporations or partnering with public agencies or private entities, whether nonprofit or for-profit. So now they can really wheel and deal. They don't have to be stuck in this mold of taking the money from the federal government, building the public housing project, and running it. They can take partners. They can have theoretically they could even do for-profit, or I should say market housing to subsidize low-income housing. They could do a lot of things that they couldn't do before. So that opens up this new world of possibilities. All right. Now we get to the map. There's the map. So that's the map. So, and that's what people have become very excited about, because by 2015, researchers, that's when we have the really best data. Unfortunately, it's a while ago, but still, it shows you the trend. Almost a quarter of all PHAs owned more than 150,000 dwelling units outside of the old conventional HUD public housing stock. So that, and by the way, the implication there is that they don't have to follow all the rules and restraints that had sort of bound and made public or encourage public housing authorities to be so conservative. They can kind of do different things. And so you have at least 464 out of about 1,000 PHAs that were surveyed owned 112,000 non-public housing units. And they had developed or redeveloped 127,000 units with this mixed financing using the tax credit or other non-federal funding. So this is good. Also 170 public housing authorities, at least by that time, owned 29,000 tax credit units spread out in 350 projects. This is much more variegated than ever has happened before. So that's why it's exciting. And these public housing authorities owned about half of their tax credit developments outright and half as partners in limited liability corporations, which could be nonprofit or for-profit. So they are becoming entrepreneurial here. And so people in the government and outside the government became very excited. The head of the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, Tom Davis, declared about the RAD programs, these RAD programs, housing authorities have demonstrated an appetite to be creative and entrepreneurial mission-driven actors. Very good for social housing. But I have to add that the evidence also shows that the transformation of public housing authorities into entrepreneurial social enterprises is as yet partial. A shift in the financing of public housing doesn't always indicate a complete shift in the activity. At least some of the units that are counted as outside of HUD-assisted housing are likely dwellings that the housing authority already owned and managed. In other words, they still own the same units, but they've refinanced them, which is good. Now they can renovate them or rebuild them, however, but it's the same, more or less the same units. Housing authorities are pursued purposes that were worthy, but not necessarily entrepreneurial. And so there are different examples of that. The high-performing agencies, which tend to be the large ones, participated in RAD by developing affordable housing, but others used the RAD money that they got just to keep their agency running without having to rely on the appropriations from HUD, which come and go, or to their credit, serving low-income groups or providing social services. So we have that. In fact, only a minority of public housing authorities participated fully in the reform programs such as Moving to Work and RAD. So we have a kind of split between the large units, the large public housing authorities, or shall I say the sophisticated and active housing authorities, which tend to be the largest ones, not always, and the majority of small PHAs, which are usually in rural areas, and they've been less able to meet HUD's assessment standards of performance or to take advantage of these new programs. All right, so to summarize, because of the wide range of local housing markets, political cultures, and capabilities of the PHAs, the housing authorities have varied greatly in the way they've responded to the new possibilities of operating. A small but growing number of PHAs, I'm sure the numbers I gave you of all the accomplishments have increased a lot in the last 10 years. They've seized the opportunities to diversify their business methods and their goals. But so far, many, perhaps most authorities have not participated in or fully exploited the reform programs. So somewhere here, I have my conclusion. Which I've lost. Here it is, the conclusion. So you'll be happy to know. So what have we learned? That despite the travails the public housing authorities have faced, they have actually performed the task of providing rental housing to very low-income households adequately and sometimes very well. And furthermore, many PHAs have participated in these sweeping reforms of the last 20 years. They've changed the way they do business, even now to the point of owning housing that is not part of the public housing program. And so as such, the answer to the question, the public housing sector can potentially play an important part in a new social housing system, but not all public housing authorities have the capacity to become entrepreneurial, dynamic social enterprises. So the history of public housing in the U.S. suggests that under a social housing regime, the housing authorities, in my opinion, will more or less, generally speaking, bifurcate, much as they have in the past. And in that sense, one component will be a cadre of high performers that draw on federal, state, local, or private financing to develop new housing, provide an array of services, chart new service territories and methods, and in other ways function as social enterprises. The other component is a large number of sound but relatively unspectacular agencies that continue to manage a small number of dwellings, perhaps using the new forms of financing and ownership, but don't do much else. And in that sense, I would say that it looks like the public housing sector could come to resemble the nonprofit housing and community development field from which it has borrowed so many techniques. So with that, I think oh wait, there's one more. I'm sorry, I meant to show you the villages of Eastlake. There we go. All right, I will stop the share.
Thank you, Alex. It is a long and complicated history, so I really appreciate your being able to summarize it so succinctly. So there's some questions coming into the Q&A. I'll keep my eye on those. So people do submit those. I can't guarantee we'll get to all those. Alex, you can keep your camera on. We're going to keep you in the hot seat for a little bit. Although we were having trouble with your audio, so if that persists, perhaps your camera being off might be better.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it off for a while. Let me know. And it just froze, so I didn't quite hear the last comment, although I can, yes.
I was just throat clearing to say we'll get started.
Okay.
So let me start. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a few questions, and then I'll look at the Q&A to get some of the folks' questions from the audience here. Let me start with the origin story here of public housing. I think we're at a time now where there is this growing movement towards social housing. Um, there are a lot of factions involved in that. And I think when I look at your story about the rise of public housing, you talk about the emergence of a movement. Can you say a bit about the importance of that movement? Also, in terms of who's in the movement and how that affects the outcome, and are there lessons for today in terms of people thinking about a movement for social housing, how you might need to constitute that movement to have the political power you need, but also to steer towards the result that folks want to see?
Yeah. Should I put on my video?
Why don't you
Uh,
try it? If your audio flakes out, you can try
the
to turn it
signal.
off.
Okay, great. Just, I don't know why. I can't see anybody anyway, but I feel better. Um, yes, there were different groups, activists, let's say, that wanted public housing. It really started with settlement house workers and socialists in New York City. Um, who really were concerned about slum dwellers. So they had a social worker point of view. They wanted to help the poor, downtrodden slum dwellers, right? And then you had what you might call the social democrats, who were of one sort or another. They didn't always call themselves that, but they were looking for a broad base working class movement, a political movement, right? Um, and they actually were just getting started to convince leaders in New York, and Al Smith and Franklin Roosevelt, they were governors, and the others, the mayors and so on, in the 1920s and in the early 1930s, when the Depression hit and the Democrats were swept to power into Washington. Now, so what that meant is the whole movement got kind of short-circuited. What normally you would have, or what they were trying to do, is start with New York and then spread out across the country with a movement that would root these ideas in all the different cities and places around the country. What they ended up with was an opportunity to go directly to a federal program, and so they did. Now you have to sell the federal program, and the common denominator was, as I mentioned, slum clearance and slum redevelopment. So now you have something else, really. I mean, that's interesting to think of today. Are we interested in redeveloping neighborhoods, or are we interested in providing housing to people of lower incomes, And so that right away, those goals, which seem overlap, and they can overlap, but they also can be in tension. And the slum clearance part basically erased the broad base of housing approach. Is that helpful?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll add my 2 cents. When I read about the early history of public housing, it was interesting is that as you mentioned in your presentation, there wasn't a groundswell of poor people pushing for this, and there were some kind of thought leaders doing it. And my take is that Catherine Barrow was really important in attaching herself to the labor unions, which did have a movement and created more of an alliance. Today we have a housing industry that's much more organized in terms of the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, the sports, light tech. We have other movements that are rising, which is a tenants justice movement. We have a YIMBY movement. And so as I look out there, look at the landscape, I see 3 different, at least, constituencies. And maybe you could even add public housing as a 4th, because in some respects it's become more integrated through RAD and other things with the light tech and the nonprofit world. But so I think one question is, as we think about a new form of housing, is how do you integrate all those folks plus the private sector? And so that's, I think, a kind of a point of contention, perhaps, in the conversations about social housing. And it's there's a question that come up in the chat or the Q&A too about the role of the public sector, and to what extent has a push towards neoliberalism, where we've privatized housing, been for the good or for the bad. And I think, and if we think about moving back towards a more purely public system, what would the role for the private sector be? I know you have views on this, Alex. You've written extensively on this, but do you want to comment on that tension between
No,
public purpose and private enterprise?
yeah. So the first thing is, I think to add to what you're saying, there's a kind of affordable housing movement in the United States. So there's actually much broader support, organized activity for affordable housing today than there was in the 1930s. Um, the other part of it is that housing is local, as you know. We're virtual, but housing is wherever you are. And that was the problem with the original social housing program. It took on the coloration of wherever it was located. And by that, I mean all the political dynamics as well. That's why you had racial segregation. You had good things, but you also had bad things. So I think where all those different groups bump up into one another, it's going to have to be worked out, or someone's going to have to think through, is it going to be flexible? Is it going to be different in different places? It will be different in different places because of the nature of that. And how can it be, how can a system allow for that? I guess would be my thought, rather than trying to impose, as the public housing system did, a single system, which willy-nilly is going to take on different character in different places. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to multitask here. I usually have my friend David Lubroff helping with the Q&A. Let me, uh, there's a couple different threads here, try to make them coherent, but perhaps we just have to jump around. In terms of the tenant's role, so you talk about in the paper how this was a very top-down program. The federal top-down from the federal government to localities. Within localities, there's public housing management, and very little role and room for tenants' voices. And in some respects, I think you paint that as one of the challenges or failings of the system to not have more powerful tenant voice. You mentioned, at least in part in the paper, about the other PHAs where that has been remedied. I think you give the example of Boston, where there is a tenants council that has more voice. Can you say, and I just want to give a shout out, Karen Blondell, Loeb Fellow from a couple of years ago, leading public housing tenant advocate in Brooklyn, is on the line. So Karen, it's good to have you in the audience. And knowing that she's listening, Alex, as you answer this, can you speak to how has the tenant's voice evolved over time? And what is the importance of that for the outcomes in the public housing system?
Yeah, well, I hope she would agree. Every tenant advocate I've ever met said they don't get enough time at the table and enough influence. Basically, as you said, it started completely top down and condescending, honestly. The tenants are there to be helped by us, was the attitude. In the 1960s, you get a tenants movement, public housing tenants organize, and they have rent strikes and they do a lot of things. And out of that, in the 70s, 80s, you have organizations not only of public housing tenants, but of subsidized housing that's publicly subsidized, privately owned, low-income housing groups. But in my opinion, there's a sort of binge, or there's like a moment where there's more room for tenants to have a say-so. And the HUD, to its credit, tried to institutionalize that. There's supposed to be a seat on the board of the local housing authority. But I think it's hard fought. It's always a struggle. We're at Harvard, right? The technical aspects of it are easy to talk about. We talk amongst ourselves, and you want to, then after a while, almost unconsciously, they're ignoring the tenant. I mean, there's exceptions to this, but I would say it's a struggle by the very nature of things. Now, to be fair, if you're in the private market, the tenants don't, they don't they have tenant strikes, but they don't generally, there are tenants associations, but generally you pay your rent and you get what you get. So, maybe we're being a little too strict or harsh on the public housing authorities. But it is definitely an issue that needs to be constantly addressed as, once again, not just in public housing, community action, community engagement is something that needs to be renewed constantly.
Yeah, not to start an argument per se, but I mean, I think I would say the difference between the private market and public housing in terms of the role of the tenant is that there's a sense in the private market that tenants have choice, greater choice, right? And so that if the property's not to your liking, the manager's not doing what you want, you move out. And this in public housing or a new form of social housing where public resources are being used for the express purpose of meeting the needs of the tenants, that there ought to be greater voice there, and there's less of a market mechanism for response. But
Yeah,
we're
you made the that I would make. That's great. I agree totally.
I don't know that we disagree per se, but it's always more lively, right, when there's a debate. Um, there's a bunch of questions in the chat about defining social housing and how you defined it. And so I think one thing I just want to own up to is we put this in the title of the talk. I would say there's no one definition at all of what social housing is. But Alex, repeat what the definition that you gave at the beginning. I,
All right, I have to look it up. It's
I,
here it is. Government or government-funded agencies develop, own, and manage housing for low-income Americans outside the private for-profit market. And I know Rachel Brad is out there somewhere and she's saying, and it has to be permanently affordable low income. All right, so I put that in for you, Rachel.
That's great, Alex. And I think in some sense that's the big tent of what social housing is. I would say I would add to that, and a lot of the folks who are in this movement, that another key part is what we were just talking about, which is resident voice, and that resident voice is an important part of what makes it social. The other piece, and this is perhaps more controversial, is that it's less restricted by income. And at one extreme, not restricted by income at all. But the notion is much more mixed income housing. And I guess, so my question I put to you is, as you think about this, as someone who studied this, what are the pros and the cons of thinking about a mixed income housing community? And there's one side of the coin, I guess, which is the kind of the health and vitality of that as a social community, as a financial community. But there's also a question, and this was from Dan Emmergluck in the audience, that says, in a world in which the resources we have for helping people get access to housing, and 1 in 4 of the lowest income folks get access, should we be devoting resources to that mixed income source type of housing? So I threw a lot at you, but what's your response to
Yeah,
kind of focusing on mixed income?
yeah. Yeah, thank you, Dan. That is the argument that people have been having since the 1930s. Catherine Bauer and many others look to Europe, and when you look at the European programs, they did not start with a low-income requirement. And in fact, I think estate housing in England still doesn't have an income restriction. They have other restrictions, but so there is, on the one hand, the idea of a broad-based mass housing program for, let's say, the middle. Usually people don't go all the way up to luxury. There's a middle class and below. And the idea is that you can reach down to the lower income groups because you have such a popular mass-based program. That's the theory. The other theory, which has been, and I want you to listen carefully, proposed or presented by conservatives as well as liberals, but at different times and sometimes at the same time, is just Dan's point. They're poor people, they have greater needs, everybody else can get along somehow, but these people are the most deprived, and so they should have the priority. So, and then there is a third element, which is property management, right? Because you have to figure out a financial system that allows for maintenance and to keep a quality of life in your residential area. So you've got to figure out where is that money coming from. So those are the 3 aspects that have to be balanced. I myself I'm sympathetic to all sides, really, particularly the property management one. But I would say I'm not, I don't think mixed income is the end all and be all of social life. I've lived in mixed income areas, and the thing is, people tend to stick to their own, unfortunately. There's of course examples, but so I don't really see anything great virtue in having a affluent professional next to a working class person, but I'm not against it. That's where I've lived all my life in places like that. So it's got to be thrashed out. But the other thing is, a lot of where we ended up, people talk about neoliberal in the private sector and so on. We ended up because the other system, the other approach, let's say, didn't work. It doesn't mean it was immoral or fatally flawed, but it didn't work. So people like ourselves, good, strong, idealistic people, adapted and they came up with these other ideas. And in Atlanta, Georgia, which is kind of the showcase of the most forward acting housing authority in the country, they redid all their public housing projects as more or less mixed income. And the reason they did that is they wanted to redo the whole image of public housing. You saw that slide I showed of distressed housing where the people look like they're living in a slum, right? But it's actually public housing. So there are, let's say Dan's right, and let's vote with Dan. But you have to address the financial issues to make it viable so that the whole thing doesn't just deteriorate, as has happened over and over again, into something that completely looks like what it was supposed to solve.
Yeah, and I think the question in my mind is when we turn to the private sector because what we were doing before wasn't working, and among the many reasons why what we were doing before wasn't working was a lack of adequate public support for maintaining and investing in this housing, the overly bureaucratic nature of it. It's a question of could we do that better and still have the public sector play a leading role? Or perhaps not. Maybe something there is kind of intrinsic into the way public processes work that make it more difficult. But we only have a few
And
minutes remaining. Yes, you can respond.
I just throw in the problems with public housing came, the projects that were built were financed. If you go in the 1950s, they were financed. They had the financing. They built these glitzy high-rise projects. What happened is they couldn't attract tenants after a while because there were alternatives in the private market that people preferred. Not to say that the government wasn't stingy or mean and awful, especially later when they really needed the money. But it's not, I think it's not to deny the point, but to say it's not simply a matter, the product that you offer is a very important part of it. And that's where the mixed income people get the better of the argument because it looks nice and it attracts people.
We're almost out of time, Alex. Briefly, one of the questions that this is kind of getting to the end of the paper where we're looking at the state of public housing authorities today. You're talking about this smaller number of larger, high functioning housing authorities. One of the questions is people were surprised that, gee, bigger isn't always necessarily better. Why does bigger seem to be aligned with being better able to adapt in this case?
Yeah, well, I think it may be partly the bigger ones happen to be where the political will and tradition of government and liberal programs and social programs are stronger and support for it stronger. Actually, a lot of these big housing authorities, as you know, Chris, went into terrible crisis. Washington, D.C., Boston, now New York. So it's the bigger, to their point, it's not always better. But big cities tend to have professional planners, a lot of more access to the kinds of professions and resources, big city governments, that the smaller community doesn't. And also more potential market than you get into a smaller community with low income people. They really don't have not only the professional resources, but they can't kind of break the cycle of the market and attract other people,
Yeah, and I would add to that I think size helps in some sense because these other functions require specialized staff. And in small organizations, which are kind of skeleton budget in many respects, to having specialized staff is a luxury that can't afford. I wouldn't underestimate either the moving to work program in creating flexibility of how money is spent and the rules that are followed, which was applied to large public housing authorities that gives them the opportunity to be able to develop that specialized staff too. I would be remiss if I'm sitting here in Cambridge, I don't give a shout out to the Cambridge Housing Authority, the Boston Housing Authority, which I think are both among those entrepreneurial organizations. Cambridge Housing Authority knows that, in fact, like you described, acting now as a consultant to other housing authorities to take advantage of the capacity they've built. We've really only scratched the surface here. The paper will be out next week. There's a lot more of the history in there. Some of the questions I don't want to duck, but we didn't get the time to go into, which is the issue, and you talk about this in the paper, the history of the way in which public housing recreated and reinforced racial segregation, and the questions about whether or not going forward, we certainly need to be attuned to the way in which a new program may or may not address that issue. We certainly wanted to improve integration, don't want to reinforce segregation, but there's lessons there as well in the paper. I'll give you the last word, Alex, and this is an unfair question, but as an historian, for people who are contemplating a new form of housing going forward, what do you have a main piece of advice for them as you look back?
Yeah, just try to be careful and not assume the model just by itself. Don't fall in love with your model. Go and look on the ground at the dynamics in communities in particular that are at play and try to figure out how that system, that model is going to play out. Don't just have a beautiful castle that you've built it and try to think, okay, that's going to work.
I think that's a great place to end. There was a question in there about whether or not we could import the Dutch model to the US. And in my conversation with Alex, he says, you have to recognize what you're importing it into is a very elaborate system that exists that you're not going to wipe away. And so whatever we build has to be built within the foundations of what we have, hopefully discarding the pieces that don't work, adding what does work, but you can't just start from scratch. So history is important. It's great to have a historian's point of view on this. Alex, I really appreciate your work on this paper. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to just a fraction of your questions. We'll see if we can answer some afterwards. Look for the paper next week, and we will keep the conversation going because this is an important one. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris.